Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. We are here in Boston, Massachusetts at the annual meetings of the American Academy of Religion and the Society for Biblical Literature. And I'm joined today by Erin Crider. Erin is the author of Planting the Word, Missional Ecclesiology in 21st Century America. She's the director of church planting at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and the author of Writing Spiritual Autobiography, Discerning God in Your Personal Story. Erin, welcome.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Thank you so much for being with us. Okay, so we're discussing your new book, which is out now with Baylor Press.
Yes,
Congratulations.
It is. Thank you.
It's very exciting. And holding it in your hand, this physical object that you have created. So well done. Well done. Okay, so you begin in chapter 1 with a discussion surrounding Roland Allen and Donald McGavran and the move from missions to church. So how does missions become church planting? Because obviously that nomenclature has shifted through the years in significant ways. And so how does it become church planting? But then also, how does it do that without veering into something looking a lot like colonialism?
That's a great question, actually. And it's actually speaking to the heart of what they were trying to address, because one of their concerns, for instance, Roland Allen was writing, I think, almost exactly 100 years ago.
Wow.
In the heyday of a lot of cross-cultural missions, which were certainly not always healthy. And part of his interest in switching the nomenclature from missions to church planting was actually quite a lovely post-colonial instinct, looking around and saying, why is it that all these healthy, thriving churches in Africa that have been, going for so long are still called missions and are never called church? So if we rethink what we're doing as partnering with the Spirit to watch churches come to life and watch God raise up local leaders and local expressions of Christianity, we're going to be in a much better place. So happily, that was initially the instinct. And Don McGavran is one of those people that not everyone's heard of, but a lot of people have felt the force of his work. And in part, he was arguing for something very similar. He was concerned about missions that took the form of things like schools and hospitals, although those are wonderful things, I think, and a wonderful gift to the community. But his concern is that those would sometimes cause people to lose focus on what the mission actually is. And by trying to define mission more carefully, he actually was helping to move church away from expressions that, again, while wonderful and commendable, can probably be more easily caught up in an imperial or colonial project than, partnering with the Spirit to create churches. Now, there are, of course, always problems in that instinct, but I think to the extent that we're letting the Spirit work in ways that are going to be indicative and reflective of the local context, it's a very different animal. I think one of the beauties, too, of church planting as it's come to the U.S. is it's made more Christians aware that mission isn't just something we do cross-culturally. It's not that we're going into some faraway place and making them like us. Not at all. Mission is something we're all called to do within our own community and context. And I think that's been a real positive gain from the church planting movement.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things that change in nomenclature provides is a kind of teleological description of where we're headed, right? So if we're going to go do some kind of outreach program, the goal here is church formation. Right. But to do that, you do kind of need a critical mass of numbers.
Yes.
And so how does a church planter balance the numbers game of trying to get a sufficient number of people with the kind of broader goal of transformation of communities into the image of Christ, as you have so beautifully put it?
Well, I think it's really a question of priorities, that sometimes the same actions can look very similar but be motivated by very different things, and that underlying motivation matters. If your goal is to create a loving and stable community with enough of a critical mass that it can keep itself going and that people can minister to one another and encourage one another, that's a beautiful thing. If your first concern is having to meet growth goals from your mission sponsoring agency, which it is for a lot of people, that leads you down some very different pathways. And I think you may end up doing very similar things, but the motivation will be different. And the impulses in terms of what kinds of activities you're willing to do and what kinds of activities you might ask some hard questions about can change. So I think, as you said, it's kind of the telos. What is our ultimate goal here? And that's a hard thing to do in the midst of a lot of very real, very practical concerns. To the extent that we can keep that focus where it should be, I think the actions will come from a very different place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would imagine that if that motivation is at least, attempting to be in the right place. It's not always, but at least attempting to be. That would also probably presumably help with things like burnout, disillusionment, those kinds of difficulties which face anyone trying to do something hard, but certainly also for the church planter.
Absolutely. Yeah. Practical realities weigh very, very heavily. I mean, I think a lot of us have experienced that in different phases of our own lives and ministries, that there is often a certain pressure or concern, and particularly there's often a time horizon that we have to do things within a certain time period. And God never moves on human time periods ever. And so to give the space for people and the Spirit to work in their own way is going to look very different than we expect. It will often take very unexpected forms and timetables, but in the long run, it's a lot healthier for everybody, including the pastors. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, too, to the extent that that is a shared goal, it creates a different culture within the church, too. To be aware that we're looking for something sustainable is the word I like to use, that this needs to be something that can continue to function.
Right. Yeah. And, thinking about sustainability and also thinking about the long term, and really, I suppose just the church at large has experienced over the course of the last couple decades some significant failures in leadership, moral failures, personal failures, unhealthy leadership patterns. And so you say in chapter 2 that it is the responsibility of every church, including planted churches, to transparently acknowledge shortcomings, to lament the pain and brokenness that sin engenders, and to actively seek better ways forward. So what are those better ways forward? And how can church plants seek that way forward from the start?
Well, I think you're right that a lot of the conversation is centered on leadership. I think, again, part of it is to recognize that's the responsibility of the whole church. And one of the things when I was researching, it broke my heart how often I would read stories of churches that collapsed because of a leadership failure. And yet the more I read, the more I realized, no wonder, this was a very, very high pressure environment. Any ministry is. But church planting has some really unique features that I think can be profoundly isolating. Tim Morey, in the book Planting a Church Without Losing Your Soul, has articulated those much better than I can. But one of the things I think we have to be aware of is, especially in a small church where people are expecting the pastor to do everything and believe, the eternal fate of my friends depends on the pastor delivering a bang-up sermon the week I happen to get them here. No one can sustain that. That's not a reasonable way to think. To the extent that we as a whole church take ownership of our place as part of the body of Christ and as the hands and feet of Jesus, that takes a significant amount of pressure off the pastor. And it also challenges us, as I say, all to lament, instead of when a leader fails, to put all the blame on them and cast them out, I mean, there need to be some healthy safeguards and healing, to be sure. But to recognize what's our role in creating a culture where this could happen is, I think, a really important conversation. I'm a pastor's daughter, so I have immense sympathy for pastors. And I've seen firsthand that sometimes people in church are very understanding a pastor needs space with family or needs vacation until their aunt's in the hospital or you have a need. And that's understandable. It's a very human instinct. But to the extent that you have a healthy church body that can rally around one another and rally around the pastor sometimes when needed, you've set yourself up for a very different experience of church. And I think that will relieve pressure on the pastor and create a lot of alternatives if something does come up, whether it's, maybe physical illness on the part of the pastor or something else. You don't want it to be so pastor-centric that your pastor can't be human.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the nice things potentially about a church planting context is that you do have a sort of all hands on deck feel where, we need a children's ministry and, which parent here is going to volunteer for that? As someone who has volunteered for children's ministry in small churches before, there's a real sense in which, at least in a healthy context, that there is a recognition that the pastor can only do so much.
Yeah.
But, those pressures change as the church grows and develops. Could you talk a little bit about some of the growing pains in that sort of middle space,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I've read some statistics that have come out I think, post-pandemic that are looking at which churches have done well and which ones have struggled. And it is actually the middle-sized churches that often have the most difficult growing pains. Smaller churches, as you said, are so small that they're very tightly knit. If someone's not there, everybody notices. And it tends to be an all-hands-on-deck situation. Larger churches have so much happening that they have a lot of excess capacity in some cases, or if not excess capacity, at least there's a lot of different directions that people can go. It's the middle-sized churches where Americans will come in expecting all the bells and whistles of a big church and not finding them. But also when it's a little too big to be that kind of intimate fellowship you get in a smaller church, that things can be difficult. So I think as churches grow, the leadership structure also needs to grow so that there's a clearer sense of who is responsible for what, who can help with what. You know, there are more people around to participate in ministry at a staff level in addition to more volunteers. And so, again, it's a cultural thing, but when it gets to be larger, it's easier for more passive people to get connected. And so that's where, as best you can, trying to maintain that sense of family and all hands on deck, I think, is a very helpful way to navigate that. But it's a difficult season, no two ways about it.
So, but it does bring up this question that we are, whether we want to be or not, in a community of people in which we all have to work together.
Yes.
But that is always the way that, for instance, the gospel is presented.
Right.
So you write about how Billy Graham has a somewhat individualistic soteriology about what it means to be saved, which certainly would have had an impact on the way that church planting took root following the Great Awakening. So tell us about that kind of historical context for church planting, and then kind of where you think we're moving today.
It's a great question. Yeah. It was one of the interesting things. I was researching what mission had looked like around the time that churches were formed. And of course, Billy Graham is there as this, wonderful shining beacon of what mission looks like, particularly in America. And I think one of the real gifts of his ministry was to remind us that just because you live in a country where there's a lot of churches doesn't mean everyone is having the same, personal experience of God and his love and his redemption. And it was interesting to me that he would use a lot of the same strategies with American audiences that he would use in overseas audiences where there was no expectation of background of faith. And I think that was a healthy reminder that that there's a place for mission and for clear gospel teaching in every community. And that was a gift. The downside is because for very good missional reasons, he was choosing to minister outside the context of a church. You could almost come away thinking, well, if it's all about me, why do I need to connect to a community? Especially in the time when he was working, when American consumerism famously was on the rise. We are such an individualistic culture. That message really has to be preached strongly that, you need community, we need church. And it's very countercultural. One of the things I sometimes see is, I call it sort of the Billy Graham effect. So many people rightly admire Billy Graham, who would deliver a magnificent sermon and thousands of people come streaming down the aisles, that a pastor of a local church can feel like somehow they failed if, I delivered my sermon and thousands aren't coming streaming down my aisles. But it's always a little more complicated than that. Billy Graham was partnering with churches, and he was not a local pastor. In many cases, people who came down the aisles had a relationship with a local church. So the work of that local pastor had certainly gotten them to that place. And the work of the local pastor was going to carry them forward after then. You don't see it, but it matters. And so to not feel like something is wrong if you're not seeing thousands streaming down the aisle every Sunday, I think is an important corrective that we need to remember, that church is doing something different than he was. Both are important, but you're not going to have the same ministry.
Yeah, and I suppose in this kind of media-saturated environment where you have these very flashy, televised, significant events, not to speak ill of all of those, but, the kind of unsung heroes of that are the local community leaders, the pastors, who are going to be there when the big event leaves.
Yes.
Right? And who can sustain growth and discipleship over the long haul.
One of my mentors in the UK was the late, great Michael Green, who had been sometimes referred to as the Billy Graham of the UK. I can understand why people would say that. I'm not sure it quite characterizes his ministry, but he loved going to university campuses, and I got to participate with him where he would, very much in the Billy Graham spirit, find a way to announce the good news, speak to students, and we would see some really interesting moves of the spirit in response. But one thing he said is, if you're choosing to participate in something like that, the question you always want to ask is, what's the follow-up? Because you don't want to leave people to figure out their own way forward. You want them to find community. And so make sure there's always that place. So again, there's always a place for both. You can't really do one without the other.
Yeah. Okay, so you've written this book about church planting, which, perhaps the first question to be asked is like, well, what do you think the church is, right? I mean,
Right.
if we're planting these churches, an ecclesiology is going to be very helpful. So you turned to Dietrich Bonhoeffer for some of these theological distinctions, and you reference his distinction between churches and the purely human gatherings that they might resemble.
Right.
So how does that distinction clarify Bonhoeffer's missional ecclesiology and then your own?
That's a great question. Bonhoeffer, I think, was more focused on ecclesiology than overtly missional ecclesiology. But one of the points that he made is that, we need to recognize that churches can look like other things, but they're not. I suppose my thinking on this was really clarified by a couple of conversations. One was a conversation I had with Matt Kirkpatrick at Wycliffe Hall, who's a known Bonhoeffer scholar. And he was saying, the thing is, churches don't have to meet goals to matter to Jesus. A church is not a business. And I think that was one of the more helpful clarities. He said, a church is not an organization that has a specific set of tasks they have to accomplish to matter. They do have callings, they do have mission, but a church is like a family. And, kind of like we're approaching Thanksgiving, gathering with your family, you don't really have to achieve anything for that to be a meaningful time. The point is that you're together. And on some level, God's heart is always to gather people into the family. And that's something we need to be very attentive to. And I thought that was an important, point of clarity, how much he loved the church and saw the church as the body of Christ, the hands and feet of Christ, and would honor the fact. One time he even talks about Christ disguised as the church community, which I thought was beautiful and a picture of how we minister. But to take it a step further, my PhD supervisor, Tom Greggs, has this beautiful section at the start of his book on dogmatic ecclesiology that if you think about your Acts 1 church, they're doing a lot of church-like things. They have a business meeting, they hire somebody, they pray all the time. But most theologians would say it's not really the church till Acts 2 when the Spirit shows up. So a lot of what we do, again, looks the same, but the question is it just us doing the work, or are we partnering with God in creating the church?
Right.
That's the difference. Are we the body of Christ in our community, or are we just a nice community? And it's an important distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose in grad school I read Communio Sanctorum.
Yeah.
It was a very long time ago, so I'm trying to put all the pieces together. But that sense that the church is a normal community, and so you can do sociological analyses, you could do anthropological analyses, all of that stuff could apply to the church as it does to any other community.
Yes.
And yet Bonhoeffer wants to say that there's more. There's something more happening here, and that's kind of, I think, what you're drilling in on here.
Absolutely.
That it's more than just a gathering.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so the same criteria we would use to assess another gathering might not necessarily apply. And there's a lot we can learn from those other gatherings, but recognize they're not going to be a perfect analogy or a perfect model.
Yeah. Okay, so in the final chapter of the book, you look at some practical ways forward, and you turn to the Nicene Creed.
Yes.
So here we are, anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. Well-timed.
Yes.
Well played. So how do the four marks of oneness, holiness, Catholicity, and apostolicity provide an assessment model for planted churches?
Well, I think one of the questions I sometimes hear from church planters is, what else are we looking for here? Because numbers feel so tantalizingly tangible that to assess based on, how many people are here or what our budget looks like, what our buildings look like, that's often the first very tantalizingly tangible thing you can grasp. So then what? Well, again, for 1,700 years now, we have proclaimed the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. And that becomes more a statement of identity and begins to hit at some of the qualities of the church that are going to be very different than what you might see in other places. I think all of those are a gift of the Spirit. To be one, we're never going to be there perfectly, but do you see your church moving in ways that create bonds between people who would not normally connect or converse? Because even in the ancient world, that was a powerful witness of the early church to see. Even though, and even in the New Testament, with Paul there fussing at him, it got a little bumpy at times. But to see Jews and Gentiles sitting down together at a meal was a statement that was profound. And even today, in the face of so many divisions that seem to be growing wider every day, for people to sit down together in fellowship and recognize something bigger than themselves matters more.
Yeah.
That's an incredible gift. So to the extent that churches are seeing that happening, it's worth celebrating and it's worth acknowledging. Whether or not the numbers are there yet, that's a gift of God, and that's a move of God in that space. Holiness, it frustrates me a little that it was second, but, I didn't write the creed. But holiness is, how we create space to commune with a holy God. So I've heard some wonderful talks on that while I'm here. What are the ways that different people connect with God, and how, as much as possible, can we leave space for that to happen in our services? Because, I've joked with someone, sometimes services can feel more like homeroom, where you get your list of tasks and so much stuff you're supposed to do. And again, that matters. It's an organizational strategy. But are we also creating enough space for people, even in children's ministry, maybe especially in children's ministry, to see something of God and to learn something new about what God's love really means? Are we Catholic? And this is one that I think matters, especially in America, where we have so many different traditions and denominations. Are we reaching out? It's kind of like unity on the church level. Are we reaching out to other churches? Are we partnering together meaningfully? To the extent that we do, that alone is a profound witness, because we're in a business culture. We're used to seeing people compete, and we're not competitors, we're co-laborers.
And the line between entrepreneur and church planner is very thin.
Very thin.
Some of those skill sets, it seems to attract a similar kind of person in many instances. And so that sense of competition and kind of tribalism can be unintentionally baked in from the beginning.
Well, and just to be aware that that's a thing, and to be aware that our calling is different, is a healthy reminder when the pressures kick in or when our natural instincts start to rise. That's why I think it's a gift of God, because it calls us to rise above so much that we do. Interestingly, I find church planters in some ways are some of the most Catholic that you would encounter with lower C. There are conferences for church planters where people will happily sit down with people from very different traditions and talk. There is a strong shared sense of mission and culture that I think has been really striking to me as I've done the research, to see that even in different communities, different spaces, there's a very strong shared set of priorities that can really create some fabulous conversations and some spaces for unifying. I hear when planners sit down and talk together, a lot of times the conversation is, oh, you too? And I think that's a beautiful thing to see. And may we see more of it. And then the last one, apostolicity, is probably one that church planters have had in their heads from the beginning. Being sent out is the way that I'm defining it. It can mean a lot of different things, but to be sent out, to be a messenger to the world, to be a witness in your community. Are we actually looking outward, or are we just building up our own community? Both need to happen, but to be reminded of all four things instead of honing in on just one. It's a tough balance, but it gives you something else to look for other than the numbers.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So in what ways then do you hope this book furthers the conversation around missional ecclesiology? Obviously, that conversation has been going on for quite a while.
It has.
So how do you hope this book contributes to that?
Well, I think this is an interesting new chapter in what missional ecclesiology looks like in certainly modern American context, that it's changed from what it was years ago, again, because of that new focus on mission in the local church, a very healthy focus in some ways, but it's worth drawing that into discussion. I think we need to also be very aware that this is something that's had a much wider influence too. I was just walking around here, and there are some really interesting books that I saw on, for instance, African diaspora churches and what their expressions of this very similar instinct looks like in different communities from a different cultural context. That's beautiful. And a lot of times conversations about church planting have happened in those very separate spaces. To see that come together so that we can have those moments where we can begin to think through, okay, what are the shared challenges? How are different people meeting them? What are the really interesting exceptions to the norm, and what can we learn from that? What's the influence of this even outside the space of church planting? Because I talk to other pastors who will feel instincts to adopt some of the same strategies without really thinking through the theology behind it and whether that's a fit for them or not. So to be able to bring that into the conversation as a common expression, but also as a factor in shaping culture and ideas about mission and church, I think would be a really huge gain for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for writing such a remarkable book. Congratulations on its publication. Thank you for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you. It has been a delight.
All right. Well, pick up Erin Crider's latest book, Planting the Word, at BaylorPress.com.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.